Well, hello everybody. Welcome into Great Atmosphere here on January 17th of 2024. A little bit late today. We're getting started. Had some real-life work stuff that got in the way of getting a full forecast video out this morning. Ultimately, just wanted to take a look at some short-term and medium-term forecasts out here in the southeast. We're going to start today by looking at the water vapor imagery over the contiguous U.S. and North American subcontinent. We see our major dry slot that has kind of inserted itself in the mid-levels overhead of us, making its way through the area, really kind of stabilizing the majority of the upper atmosphere right above our heads, leading to a cloudless sky and high pressure directly overhead. We do have our next troublemaker out in the Mountain West currently, not delivering so much in the ways of precipitation as much as it did last week, but ultimately still delivering a good amount of high winds. And the Pacific Northwest has gotten a little bit of a break. They've been under pretty much non-stop blizzard conditions for pretty much all of last week. They get a little bit of a break and generalized just mountain clouds and rain in the southern tier of California. Northeast has been kind of dealing with some lake effect issues, with the Great Lakes still not being totally sealed off with ice, actually not even remotely sealed off with ice due to the warm December. They, generally speaking, have kind of a open fire hose of potential for lake effect going into the next at least a month, I would say, before things really start to freeze over there. Taking a look at actually what we've seen in the past 72 hours in terms of rainfall, the shortwave trough that pushed through our area just on Tuesday actually delivered a little bit more rain than we might have been expecting. We knew that the majority of the rain would be in the eastern escarpment of the Blue Ridge and the Tennessee side. Ultimately, we did not see as much rain as we thought here in the Nantahala region of North Carolina and the far western regions of the state and the upstate of South Carolina, but we did see a lot in the Roanoke-Blacksburg region of Virginia. So that's just probably has to deal with where that trough was ultimately placed and where that ultimately was laid out, because as it was a positively tilted trough like this, it received quite a bit of overrunning, and wherever this little indicator was where these two different streams within the atmosphere met on top of one another altitudinally was where the majority of the precipitation was going to lie. So it kind of went along this border, had a little bit of upslope flow, and then went out like this. So kind of interesting setup there. Nothing too crazy, only received about an inch or so in those problem areas. Everywhere else received maybe 0.2 of an inch at most, just a light shower. Taking a look at how our flagship models have performed, generally speaking, for the last week or so, both of them have been doing relatively well. GFS took a little bit of a nosedive as that system came into place. Euro was right on top of it. GFS was expecting a little bit more of a precipitation event on the western portion of the Appalachians that ultimately did not pan out, which I believe is attributed to its low forecast verification rate. We're going to take a look ahead in the short term real quick at what we are expecting here in the next few days. So currently we are under generally zonal flow as we move through the rest of our Wednesday. We see these horizontal vectors here and the upper levels of the atmosphere at 300 millibar level. Generally speaking, this is indicative of high pressure and stable air over our area, which is reflected by the current conditions in the southeast. As we move forward in time, you can see where that Pacific Northwest system starts to make its way into the plains and into the Mississippi River Valley. You can see quite a bit of a troughing that's kind of made its way. A little short wave, and look at the difference in wind speeds right there. We got like 60, low 60s to 9,500 up in the atmosphere. That kind of a disparity will certainly breed itself a shortwave trough that will ultimately provide for us a slight bit of destabilization in the upper parts of the atmosphere that should lead to some cloud cover, some light showers, depending on where the 540 line is in the mid-levels. We might see some snowflakes, but ultimately, generally speaking, the deliverer of cold air as it moves forward, and we get our big Arctic blast that we are expecting coming up in the next few days. Taking a look at what the lower levels are going to be looking like and just what that ultimately pans out to be. Here we are in Wednesday night. We can see that troughing start to take shape. Ultimately, the jet Actually, I wanted to take a look at where the jet maximum is first in the upper levels and why that I'm ultimately kind of predicting it's not going to be that big of a deal. Whenever the jet streak on a positively tilted trough like this is behind the trough axis and not out ahead of it, right here or here, that is typically an indicator that anything that occurs on the eastern side of the trough is not ultimately going to get a lot of forcing. And it's mainly opening itself up to a more temperature advection kind of system than it would a big precipitation maker. So that's the general reason why there is not a lot of energy behind this. And we can take a look at what that looks like in the lower levels. As you know, the upper levels dictate what happens in the lower levels. As we move forward in time, we can see these little short waves that occur, these little perturbations that we see in the southeast and the deep south. Those are ultimately going to be the triggers that will spark off any kind of precipitation or any kind of convection in general. Not expecting it to be highly convective in nature just because there is very little moisture transport that comes into this. You can see that the primary regions that this is drawing from are a westerly component, and into the west is Texas, and Texas is quite dry in the lower levels at the moment. If it was drawing from the Gulf instead, then we would know that this would be a pretty significant moisture event, and there would be enough to spark at least some semblance of strong convection in some respects, but ultimately not expecting a lot out of it due to that positively tilted trough axis that we see there in the low levels. As we move forward in time, this is about mid-morning on Friday. The trough starts to move off, and ultimately, even though we have strong upper-level flow above us, you can see that this is the beginning of where cold air advection begins, drawing in from the Canadian Plateau and the Great Lakes to the north. That is going to cool us down here in the southeast quite a bit as we move forward in time. And we can see what the Euro is predicting in terms of precipitation. We see that high pressure dominating due to that zonal flow that we mentioned earlier aloft. It'll be dominating here for the next 36-48 hours before we see that positively tilted trough start to make its way off of the Rocky Mountain Plateau in the Midwest, or not the Midwest, the Central Plains, and really, really light precip. We can see some overrunning in the higher elevations, and due to isentropic flow in the Alleghenies and whatnot. But ultimately, in the deep south, where there is not a lot of moisture return at all, we're not expecting much of anything. We can definitely see that 540 line is going to be well below pretty much the majority of the Carolinas, even down to 510, 516. This is some cold, cold air that's being centered right on top of us in the mid-levels. It'll be quite frigid as we move forward in time. This is Saturday morning. Might be the coldest that we see it before our big warm-up occurs next week, and the high pressure moves off, opening up the Gulf, which we mentioned in yesterday's video. So let's see what those temperatures look like. Ultimately, we'll start here on Thursday. We actually got a little bit of a warm-up for today, relatively a warm-up, due to the high pressure being a little bit further and not as strong today. But as we go into tomorrow, it'll start to strengthen. Zonal flow will start to come into place, and we see that trough start to set in. High pressure starts to move off, and ultimately the cold air and that big channel of cold air from Canada starts to make its way down into the lower 48. And you can see just what the extent is of this cold air. It pretty much comes to not an end per se, but certainly its maximum, I'd say, on Saturday early morning. What are some of these values? So all the way down to the coast. So we're talking Charleston, you're at freezing. Jacksonville's at freezing. Pretty much all the way past San Antonio, New Orleans. It's pretty much you have to get to pretty much Miami until you get into the 50s. So this is, and that's quite cold for Miami. There'll be winter coats on for sure in that part of the state. Excuse me. So that'll be the story once this little shortwave trough series starts to push through, and we get very light precipitation, if any. Frigid air will be the story as we move forward into the short term. Taking a look at what our handy Schreff plumes are looking at right now. This is in Charlotte. We can see that there's pretty significant good model consensus in terms of temperature. We're looking at highs at about 45, right there on, I believe that is what is that? That's Friday. So Friday we'll get our highs there, and then it's kind of timing out when that trough starts to push through the area. There's a little bit of disparity in confidence as to what that is. Still at 45 as a high, as a relative high, I'll say, on Friday. But we are going, as we move forward in time, as we go into Saturday, we see those temperatures begin to plummet. 22 is the mean consensus for the early morning hours of Saturday, and probably even colder still on Sunday, according to the plumes. So it'll be cold. That's the generalized short-term forecast. We'll take a look at some of the medium-term outlooks that I'm currently still looking at right now. So this is what the Euro ensemble is currently predicting in terms of what it looks like in the northern hemisphere. We see generally higher highs showing themselves over the central United States as we move forward into the next few days. We see that zonal flow start to arrive. We see our trough set in. And what's interesting here is as we look forward into what we to expect, this is kind of like a weird little omega block situation that's happening right here over the Bering Strait in Alaska. But the problem is with a typical omega block setup, and what we mean by that is kind of like this kind of pattern. Ultimately, and this is like really, really high heights and really lows. So this is and what we mean by blocking pattern means that like a situation like this, particularly in the spring or summer, if we were to see this, it would stay stationary for quite a bit of time, and whatever currently is looking at right now in terms of flow would be kind of the pattern that we would experience over the course of the next 2, 3, 4 weeks. So we don't like seeing that, but ultimately I think this center of the high is a little bit too far north. If this were right here instead and everything was kind of pushed down further south, I would say this would be a kind of an interesting blocking situation, but ultimately that flow is still relatively open as it hits the west coast of the U.S. So ultimately the west coast is still going to be inundated with quite a bit of moisture out of this. It'll just be interesting to see where that particular system right there over Alaska goes. And you can kind of see what it's thinking as we move forward. We can see that ultimately that warming trend that we discussed yesterday start to make its way in. High pressure will start to move off of the East Coast and open up the Gulf, opening us up to quite a bit of both warmer temperatures and moisture as we move into the middle part of next week. And that seems to be kind of the thing. It looks like that pattern stays there for about 4 or 5 days before we start moving ahead into time, and we start anticipating a pattern, as you can see now over here. It's moved completely out of the Alaskan region in terms of what the highs were. Yeah, it's weakened quite considerably. And that's generally, when we see that weakening, we would say that that's kind of the beginning of a new cold snap that might be making its way up into our region. But that's more of a thing to discuss probably as we move forward into February. The ending part of January certainly seems to be warm and moist, certainly not a wintry weather maker, according to the ensemble right now. And we can see that reflected in our temperature anomalies. You can see this for the next 5 days. Cold temperatures are going to be the primary story here. Definitely have to get through that. These are anomalous temperatures in the 15 degrees below normal range. And then as we move forward, just 5 days later, up to 5 to 10 days, you see that is completely changed. We have up to 15 degrees warmer in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Ontario, and Minnesota. And pretty much the whole eastern seaboard on the eastern side of the Mississippi is experiencing warmer temperatures, including the Canadian Prairie, which is quite important because the Canadian Prairie this time of year is very indicative of where we typically get our temperatures. But then you look out into the 15-day range, and you can see that new cold snap starting to load itself up again. So we're kind of in like a weird 1 to 2 week little spell here of alternating between warm and cold. It's very typical for an El Nino very El Nino-esque type of year. Subtropical jet is still churning away down here in the Caribbean Gulf and the Miami region across the Yucatan and from the Eastern Pacific. That is not going to change. The ENSO diagrams, I don't have them pulled up here, still have ENSO or El Nino quite strong pretty much all the way through March. So we'd expect those analogs to ring true for the most part going into the next couple of months. So we're just expecting our next cold snap after a nice warm and probably wet end to January. And, maybe that means my ultimate prediction going into this entire winter was that the Southeast would be due for at least one big wintry event. Wouldn't say whether it's ice or ice, sleet, or snow, but certainly wintry on the eastern edge on the eastern side of the Appalachians and the Carolinas and maybe even northern Georgia. That was my big prediction going in, that it would happen in late February, early March. So we will see if that continues to pan out. I am still relatively confident that is going to be the case based off what we've seen for the pattern thus far in the season. But that's all I got for you today. Just a quick look at short and medium term stuff. Once again, my name is Zach for Great Atmosphere. I would appreciate you if you subscribe to the channel, especially if you live in the Southeast U.S. I'll be making these weather forecasting videos for the Southeast specifically daily every weekday. So I appreciate you if you were to tune in and subscribe. And other than that, I will see you for another video tomorrow.